Good evening, everyone. Welcome. Today, I will address a topic that is not exactly a continuation of the classes I was teaching about the question of method, because it belongs to a much later stage of explaining the method. In a way, I'm skipping several chapters to focus on something that would ideally belong to the conclusion of the book. It is also not a continuation of the previous lesson on astrocaricatology, although it is quite related, as you'll notice throughout this class. It's a subject that is very dear to me because it has been an object of speculation that I have pondered within myself for many years, and about which I don't believe I have explained much until today. It is something that will greatly help you organize your thoughts and understand the framework within which nearly everything I said in this book is situated, the broader philosophical framework. This topic pertains to the following. There is a series of conditions to which we humans are subjected, stemming from the structure of the external universe, the physical universe around us, which have absolutely nothing to do with our subjective lives. In other words, our brains and our thoughts contribute nothing to them, not even minimally. The most we can do is perceive these conditions and adapt to them as best we can. They are absolutely universal, meaning all human beings are subject to them. I strongly doubt there is any element within the structure of human reason or cognition that is not entirely determined by these conditions. I believe one of the strangest things to have occurred in the history of philosophy was that, around the Renaissance, the axis of philosophical attention shifted away from the objective universe and turned toward the subject, attempting to find in the subject the explanation for all our ideas about the external universe. Later, with the development of anatomy and physiology, this explanation began to be sought in the human brain. However, the brain is nothing more than a material object, among others, and therefore is subject to the exact same external conditions to which I am referring. So, I suggest you even write down the names. Write down the names of each of these elements so that you always remember to take them into account. The list I have made is not exhaustive. There are others. I'm just providing a brief sampling. The first of these conditions is the existence of cycles. We can provide examples. There are so many cycles to which we are subject, cycles from which we cannot escape in any way, that, let's say, this idea of cycles ends up impregnating itself, in some way, into human intelligence, and determining a series of our cognitive operations, even extrapolating to areas where the idea of cycles does not function in any way. For example, everyone is familiar with the idea of historical cycles, which is one of the most debatable concepts out there. However, cycles can apply to history metaphorically or metonymically, not literally. But we can use this concept because there are areas of existence where cycles are a reality. A material reality, in fact, a brutal reality from which we cannot escape in any way. First, in your own body, you have the cycle of ingestion, digestion, and excretion. I only call a cycle a series of events that repeats mechanically and occurs for a subject who remains the same. That is precisely why I think the idea of historical cycles is somewhat metaphorical, simply because the subjects are never the same. When the cycle completes, other people are already involved. So, it is not truly a cycle. However, the cycle of ingestion, digestion, and excretion occurs daily for the same individual. There's no way to escape this. Likewise, with the cycle of wakefulness and sleep, there is absolutely no escape. All human beings, from birth to death, are subject to these cycles. It is impossible for a person not to notice this cyclicity sooner or later. For example, small children sometimes hate to sleep. They believe they can remain awake indefinitely, but then they fall asleep on the carpet and wake up in bed because someone carried them. No matter how much you resist, this cycle imposes itself on you, just as the simple daily cycle of days and nights does, with morning, midday, evening, and nightfall repeating endlessly. There is no escape. You also have, let's say, the cycle of production and consumption. For instance, in agriculture, you plant something, wait for it to grow, harvest it, and then plant again the following year. The same process repeats. Similarly, consider the lunar cycle. I wonder how long did it take for humans to realize that the moon forms a cycle. The moon doesn't appear in the sky with the same appearance every time. It shows up in many different forms, and one of those forms is its complete invisibility. How do you know these various different objects in the sky are the same moon? You cannot perceive this intuitively as you do the sun's light. You have to observe, record, and remember. Ultimately, through abstraction, you understand it's a cycle. Although you need abstract intelligence to understand it, this cycle does not originate from your abstract intelligence. It imposes itself upon you as an external reality. There are countless cycles you can observe to varying degrees. Some you are subjected to without ever realizing, but they exist all the same. Let's say this idea of the cycle, something that unfolds over time yet, in some way, returns to a previous stage without that point being identical to the earlier one, is one of the fundamental structures of human intelligence. For example, cycles show us that there is no such thing as absolute continuity for us. All temporal processes we observe are segmented. The ones we observe are the ones happening to us. Thus, there is no absolute linearity, even though we also cannot escape linearity. This idea of stages, like chapters in a book, is something inherent to the human condition to which human intelligence can only adapt. If you ask when humans invented the division of a story into episodes, the answer is that they didn't invent it. They encountered it that way. No human has ever observed a continuous process of anything. At the very least, when you're looking, you blink, and in that blink, things disappear. How long can you maintain continuous attention on any flow? Attention shifts from one point to another. It cannot do otherwise. So, this idea of stages in every temporal process is something imposed upon us by the earthly physical conditions to which we are subject. From this we derive mental structures and categories, but we invent none of them. These things are imposed upon us. If the entire idea of narrative and temporal processes is segmented into stages, then another inescapable idea arises: invisible continuity. If every temporal process I observe is segmented, divided into pieces, then necessarily, some parts of it are invisible to me. Thus, invisible continuity is also imposed upon us. Take, for example, observing the sun's movement throughout the day. How do you know it's the same sun? You didn't observe it continuously. In fact, you can't even look at it directly for long. You can only look indirectly. Without the idea of invisible continuity, human beings, well, it's not that they wouldn't have left the caves. They wouldn't even have entered them. They'd have died beforehand. If a person doesn't understand that behind the discrete, separated stages they perceive, there is a thread of continuity, they'll understand nothing. They'll be completely disoriented in the world. This idea of stages and, therefore, of narrative gives rise to a third notion. You have segmented temporal continuity, invisible continuity, and therefore the possibility of narration. Because anything you narrate, you do so using separate words, right? Words are separate, but aim to reflect a continuity that is also segmented, but not in the same way as the words themselves. Words don't correspond to the stages of temporal succession. Necessarily, then, you have the idea that it's possible to narrate as long as you divide the stages of a process differently from the natural segmentation, which is verbal segmentation, dividing into words. So, every language is an articulated system composed of separate units. There is no other way. Now, behind these separate units, when you use language or hear someone speak, you understand that they are not referring to fragmented pieces of the event, but to an invisible continuity they are mentioning, which you somehow grasp. This is universal. No human being has ever escaped this. Thus, with these two notions, the cycle and the notion of stages, and therefore invisible continuity and narrative, another imposition arises: the idea of scale and proportion. Absolutely everything we do involves some kind of proportion and scale. For example, if I want to lift a stone, I need to exert a force proportional to its weight and just a little greater to move it. Am I right? Even a cat knows that to jump over a wall, it must exert a proportionate amount of force. In all human actions and situations, we confront the reality of certain scales and proportions that are, so to speak, invincible. There is no escaping them. For example, even to stand upright, you need to exert a force proportional to your body's weight. Notice how this is not an easy task. Why doesn't a baby know how to do it from the start? Why does it get up and then fall again? It has to regulate the effort in its legs to match its body weight, something it doesn't know instinctively. This is another condition imposed upon us. Now, when we speak of proportion, it is the basic structure of human reason. Reason actually means proportion. So, if you ask me about the origin of reason, it has been imposed upon us. It was imposed, but on the other hand, our anatomo-physiological structure allows us to perceive it, store it in memory, and express it verbally. So, combining these two aspects, external cosmic conditions imposed upon us and our physical and cerebral capacity to apprehend and retain them, leads to the conclusion that the structure of human reason, intelligence, and knowledge does not derive from the brain's structure. You can investigate the brain's structure as much as you want, but the brain doesn't exist in a vacuum. It occupies a precise place in the universe where all these conditions are imposed upon it. Thus, it doesn't need to engrave all these conditions in the brain to function. For example, you know that when you wake up the next day, even though you were asleep, your mother is still the same mother from the day before. Do you understand this because your brain invented it? No, it's an externally imposed condition. Therefore, I believe that any study of neurophysiology is very interesting, but it will be useless if not combined with the study of the surrounding space-time structure. There's no escaping this. In fact, I have never seen a study of this nature. There have been some who nearly approached this idea, Erwin Panofsky, for instance, but his work was focused on aesthetics and philosophy of art. As a purely gnosiological study, I have never seen it explored with the depth it deserves. Honestly, if I'm speaking about it for the first time now, it means I should have addressed this earlier, with much more depth. I never even had the opportunity to write about it. The only thing I've written on this subject was about the triple intuition, which could serve as an introduction to this topic. In the triple intuition, I attempted to demonstrate and answer the following question. How do people perceive the existence of the sun? The sun is always there, but one day people have to recognize its presence. One thing is mere sensation, another is perception. Similarly, consider the question of when people first perceived the existence of light. I believe it was when the light disappeared, and then reappeared. The perception of light is simultaneous and coexistent with the perception of the difference between seeing and not seeing. It's impossible to perceive light except through the fact that when it is present, you can see, and when it is gone, you cannot. This direct connection between light and the structure of human consciousness is one of the most primitive elements of our presence in the world and of our cognition. Thus, I see that this ancient symbolism of the sun as a symbol of intelligence and knowledge is natural. It is a natural symbolism, not something invented. Of course, many cultural symbolisms have been created on top of this, but they must have a foundation in natural perception. Very well. Since scales and proportions are inescapable, we necessarily encounter the difference between quantity and quality. All the qualities you observe exist within a certain quantity. For instance, a sound may be loud. How loud? A sound may be high-pitched. How high-pitched? This is also imposed upon us by external conditions. For example, if it's cold, how cold? If it's hot, how hot? This is present in absolutely everything. When you identify a quality, there is always a quantity within it. That is, all qualities in principle correspond to quantities, even though they are not identical to them. I can say it is hot, but that's not the same as the degree of heat. For example, if it's 32 degrees, it's hot. If it's 45 degrees, it's still hot, but the intensity has increased. The quality of heat remains the same, only its degree has changed. Thus, you understand that heat has a gradation, but it is not the gradation itself. This too is imposed upon us, and there is no way to escape it. A mere gradation, a mere quantitative increase, does not generate a quality, and a quality by itself cannot exist without a certain quantity. At the same time, the quantity alone is not sufficient to determine the quality. So, you see that long after early humans experienced these phenomena, a discussion arose regarding primary and secondary qualities of objects. Primary qualities were defined as those that could be immediately measured: weight, size, and movement, for instance. John Locke, Isaac Newton, or Galileo, one of them or all of them together, came up with this concept. Secondary qualities were considered those that could only be perceived due to human physiology, such as color and taste. However, today we can measure all these qualities, even the so-called secondary ones. The scope of what is measurable has expanded tremendously, making this distinction invalid. In fact, this distinction was only adopted for convenience, but it created a significant prejudice against secondary qualities, which were deemed merely subjective. Yet if they were merely subjective, they wouldn't require any external stimulus. I could taste a flavor simply because I wanted to, but that's not the case. The idea that secondary qualities are subjective is entirely unsustainable. Even these qualities are imposed on us in some way. For instance, if you say that a dish is salty, how salty? Is it salty like a chicken croquette or like a bag of salt? They are not the same. This accumulation of conditions imposed on humans gives us a view of our earthly condition, our existence, our place in the world, and who we are within it. Without these conditions, we would understand absolutely nothing. On the other hand, there must be a psychophysical apparatus capable not only of apprehending and sensing these conditions, as animals do, but also of retaining them in memory and symbolizing them in some way. When I say retaining them in memory and symbolizing, it's an almost instantaneous act, because when you record something in memory, you only record part of it, which then functions as a symbol of the rest. For instance, you have an image of a cow that represents many cows or symbolizes the same cow on another day. However, it's still just one cow you're seeing at that moment. This is another aspect imposed on us in an absolutely inescapable way: the symbol. We cannot act without symbols, and everything that appears to us is a symbol of something, often of the very thing in its entirety. For example, I see Carla here, and I say, "This is Carla," but what I'm seeing is merely Carla's momentary appearance, her aspect at that particular moment. These presences are real, but they are symbols of the whole being that lies behind them. We cannot escape this because we have no perception of absolute or material continuity. Thus, any stage is a symbol of the invisible continuity underlying it. This invisible continuity cannot simply be a conclusion you draw from disparate and separate elements, because for it to be a conclusion, a product of mere abstraction, you would first have to see the separate stages as entirely disconnected and only then unify them into a continuity. Is that possible? No, it isn't. For example, I'm looking at Carla and Edson. I blink. Now I have a new perception. Is this perception completely separate from the previous one? No. Invisible continuity is always present and imposes itself upon us. This is not a conclusion we draw. It's not a creation of our minds, as Kant suggested. He claimed we perceive only isolated points and later unite them in our minds. That's not possible. These things are already interconnected in a way that reflects their presence in the structure of the universe. We contribute nothing to this. In fact, our understanding of it is problematic and gradual. You grasp these concepts over time, and when you do, your neighbor has likely also understood them. The structure of our reason, our understanding, aligns with the structure of the universe. It is not identical, of course, but it is as though it were imposed upon us. This doesn't mean reverting to the naive realism theory, where perceived objects cling to our memory like a sheet of paper. That's not what I'm discussing. I'm not talking about objects themselves, but about structures. These structures impose themselves on us not as objects of our perception, but as the conditions of our perception. They determine the possibilities of having perceptions, reasoning, memory, and so forth. Thus, our memory is not what stitches things together, quite the opposite. If the unity of the objects I perceive depended solely on my memory, I could make and unmake them at will. But when I look at Edson, close my eyes, and open them again, it's still the same Edson. Did I create this? If I had, I could replace Edson with Pedro or anyone else I wanted. The continuity of objects, which exists beyond our sensory perception, imposes itself upon us as an inescapable reality. Without this, we would be completely disoriented. If this continuity depended exclusively on our subjectivity or our brain, it would be equivalent to saying that we recreate our brain and all objects, including their unity, at every moment, which is clearly a mathematical impossibility. Additionally, we have another condition imposed upon us, the distinction between the possible and the impossible. We are surrounded by impossibilities, which define our possibilities for action within a very narrow, well-defined, and absolutely insurmountable horizon. For example, if a stone is too heavy for your strength, you cannot lift it. Or, if a creature stronger than you attacks you, it will kill you. If you are stronger, you might kill it. There's no escaping this dynamic. Similarly, if you don't plant seeds, nothing will grow. You cannot avoid this reality. The notion of possibility and impossibility is constantly imposed on us by the physical conditions of our environment. Of course, through abstraction, we can develop more general ideas about the possible and the impossible, calculating possibilities for things we will never see. However, without the initial foundation, the limits of the possible and impossible provided by the material reality around us, we wouldn't be able to conceive of anything. There's yet another structure imposed upon us, the famous apeiron from Anaximander. Everything we know forms a circle, beyond which lies something we don't know. This means that the idea of the known creates for us a horizon, beyond which there is a question mark. No matter how vast our universe of acquired knowledge and our sphere of action, there is always something beyond. Is there anyone for whom this isn't true? Perhaps only for God. For God there is no beyond. But for human beings, the existence of this circle, the indefinite beyond, is not a mental construct. It is the reality we inhabit. We always exist within a relatively known horizon, beyond which lies the unknown. This applies both in spatial and temporal terms. For example, how much can I predict about what will happen next? I predict that the people here won't start flying, because they've never done so and likely won't now. I predict it might rain tomorrow. I predict that someday, perhaps sooner or later, it's possible that Lula will be arrested. The more I try to speculate, the more the horizon fades. My capacity for temporal prediction is as limited as my spatial vision. And this limitation applies not only to me, but to everyone. For instance, if you plant certain crops, you know they take a specific amount of time to germinate and grow, and in 6 months, you can harvest them. But what if there's a frost, a sudden storm, a locust infestation? You don't know. Thus, the sphere of the predictable is situated within a larger sphere of the unpredictable. This is not because of our minds, but because reality itself is structured this way. It imposes itself on us. Of course, our ability to perceive, retain in memory, abstract, and close the learning loop to predict future events varies from person to person. Some people can go through the same experience 500 times and learn nothing, while others understand it the first time. This variability is also imposed upon us. Why? When I grasp something, it doesn't mean my neighbor has grasped it in the same way. Individual differences arising from age, time, experience impose themselves on us. Why? Because I perceive that one human may take longer to learn than I do, or that they know less, or perhaps they know more. I can only recognize this difference if I understand that I belong to the same species as them. Individual differences are only perceptible because of the identity of species. After all, no one measures their knowledge against that of an armadillo. You don't think, oh, the armadillo knows less than me. In fact, you have no idea what the armadillo knows or doesn't know. This means the division of beings into individuals, species, and genera is also imposed upon us. For example, I know that a bear is not a tomato. I can't plant a bear to grow another one. That's absolutely impossible. And this applies to every bear, not just one. Similarly, I cannot hunt tomatoes. I cannot chase after tomatoes because they don't run. This leads us to understand the entire accessible world as a network of individuals, species, and genera. We didn't create this notion. Rather, we formed the notion based on an experience imposed upon us, one that is entirely unavoidable. There's no way to confuse species. When you do, it's an error, and such an error can be fatal. For example, expecting a bear to behave like a tomato. This has never happened. No one has been so foolish as to reach that level of misunderstanding. Likewise, if you see a goat and a bear, the bear eats the goat. The goat never eats the bear. This illustrates the structures that differentiate species from one another and distinguish individuals within a species. All of this is imposed on us from the outside. We learn these things because they repeat themselves in the external universe. They don't change. If they did, we would have been lost long ago. No matter how poorly developed our ability to structure and organize may be, we would have been helplessly confused without this consistency. This also brings us to another notion, the idea of hierarchy. Everything that reaches us comes within some hierarchical order. For example, one animal is more dangerous than another. Returning to the example, the bear eats the goat. The goat does not eat the bear. Thus, you have a hierarchical relationship of dominance. Among humans, you can clearly see a hierarchy of power from the very beginning. An adult man has more power than a baby. Correct? A fully developed man has more power than a woman. A woman has more power than a baby or a younger woman, and so on. Try to escape this if you can. Measuring strength, one of the most basic human experiences, already reveals the existence of hierarchy. It isn't just two levels, stronger and weaker. No, it's far more complicated. For instance, the hierarchy of strength is one thing. The hierarchy of danger is another. A snake is far weaker than you but can still kill you. So can a spider. Thus, various hierarchies interweave into a complex system. If you get lost within it, you're done for. These structures are always the same, even though the time it takes people to perceive them may vary from one individual to another. When people do recognize these structures, they always perceive the same things. This leads to what I consider the fundamental element of political science and philosophy, the difference in power among humans. Forget about other hierarchies, the bear, the spider, etc., and focus solely on humans. There has always been, and there always will be, a difference in power among humans that can become immeasurable. For example, a father might, in a fit of rage, throw his baby out of a window. The baby cannot do the same to the father. Correct? We've all heard of societies where infanticide is practiced, such as certain indigenous tribes in the Xingu. But you've never heard of the opposite, babies killing their parents. This difference begins with age, a natural disparity observable even in the animal kingdom. When two dogs fight, or when an adult bear eats a cub, the cub never eats the adult bear. This disparity in power is significant among animals, but among humans, it becomes immeasurable. For example, in a tribe, the chief can order anyone killed, but no one else can do the same to the chief. These differences in power are highly varied because the factors that confer power on a human being change over time and are cumulative. New forms of power arise that couldn't have been imagined before. Take weapons, for instance. Carroll Quigley, in his book Tragedy and Hope, a great book by the way, observes that periods of greater equality and democracy or greater tyranny and government dominance correlate with the types of weapons available. When weapons are simple and affordable, they tend to democratize power. But when weapons become expensive or difficult to maintain and operate, power centralizes. This is obvious. For example, the expansion of democracy in 19th century America was facilitated by the affordability of firearms. A revolver cost, what, $10 or $12? Everyone could own one, and it was a fairly equalizing weapon. But later, when more complex and expensive weapons were invented, the dynamic shifted. Only a select few could possess them, granting governments greater control over populations. For instance, the American Civil War was decided largely due to one factor: repeating rifles. The invention of the Spencer rifle, which could fire 7 shots, shocked the South. They had never seen anything like it and said, "These people showed up with guns that shoot for a whole week without reloading. We're doomed." There wasn't enough time for the South to develop equivalent weaponry. These technological advances changed the fate of entire nations. The introduction of gunpowder was similarly transformative. Likewise, alongside advancements in weaponry, you must consider advancements in information. Today, information systems are both highly concentrated and extraordinarily expansive. For instance, the FBI could be recording this conversation from 2 kilometers away, and we wouldn't even know they were there. Power, ultimately, is the ability of one person to determine the actions of others. If no one obeys you, you have no power. If many people obey you, you have some power. Among those who obey, there is also a hierarchy. One person commands another, who commands another, and so on. This hierarchy can become so complex that it is unmanageable. That's the situation in today's society. You can't pinpoint the exact hierarchy because there are so many agencies operating for the central power that you don't know how they will act on you. The difference in power is thus a constant part of the human condition. The first person who realized that a creature stronger than themselves existed understood this relationship. The hierarchy, especially the hierarchy of power, is another element imposed upon us by earthly conditions and not created by our minds. None of this was created by us. Absolutely none of it. Our brain, poor thing, it registers sensory impressions, retains fragments of them, and tries to perform some abstractions based on those. That's the most it can do. It's not creating anything. In this hierarchical context, the concepts of family and community also impose themselves on human beings from the very beginning, just as they do on animals. We have families not because someone invented the structure of the family, but because if you have babies and don't feed them, they die. It's a natural condition from which we cannot escape. We reproduce. I once heard about a tribe somewhere that hadn't yet made the connection between sexual activity and procreation. They engaged in sex, and later children appeared, and they didn't know why. I also saw a famous video of a German couple. This couple went to the doctor and said, "We've been trying to have children for years and haven't succeeded." The doctor asked about their sex life, and they said, "Huh? What's that?" They didn't know such a thing existed. They were 2 rural folk from Germany who hadn't figured it out. The doctor had to explain how it works. Of course, they had children afterward. Such things can happen, but the condition is still there, imposed upon us. You may know it or not, understand it or not, but you live within this framework. Another thing imposed upon us is the concept of danger. Dangers exist in the world. You might take time to perceive them, but they are there. Therefore, the need for safety is another thing imposed upon us, just as it is upon animals. However, it's imposed differently on humans because we have a greater capacity for foresight. We can imagine dangers that don't yet exist but could arise. An animal doesn't conceive of such things. It only recognizes danger when it receives some signal of its presence. We don't need that. For example, while fishing and enjoying an abundance of fish, a human might wonder, what if there are no fish tomorrow? This fear exists within us. Thus, the necessity of foresight is another condition imposed on humans. Humans cannot live without it. Of course, in modern society, the responsibility for foresight is often delegated to certain individuals or groups, allowing many others to live without concern for it. They focus on entertainment, avoiding deeper thoughts. Why? Because there's a weather service, the police, doctors, parents and many others taking care of foresight to ensure nothing happens to these carefree individuals. But if they were suddenly deprived of this support network, they'd be in serious trouble. All these elements form the structure of our intelligence. Every one of them is imposed upon us by the terrestrial conditions in which we live. The role of our brain within this context is minimal. It merely registers, stores in memory and abstracts. People say, "We store all this in our brains, all our memories are in our brains." That's nonsense. Why do we have libraries then? Because we can't store everything in our heads. We return to books to review information. Beyond books, we have the universe itself as a mnemonic resource. The things happening around us remind us of what occurred the day before. For instance, when it rains, you think, "It rained last month too." The entire universe is a mnemonic system, a system of signs. It supports the operation of our memory, reducing the workload of our poor brains to the bare minimum. If everything depended solely on our brains, we would have died out long ago. Another thing imposed on us is the concept of spatial directions. There's no escaping it. There is up and down, left and right, forward and backward. These are the fundamental directions, and you cannot change them. You can move in any direction, but you'll always be at a specific distance relative to up, down, left, and right. This is immediately reflected in our body's structure. Where are your feet pointing? Backward? Sideways? No, forward. And your legs are positioned laterally. Notice how the structure of space is embedded in our bodies. We can move forward or to the sides, and because of this orientation, we are also able to do things like lowering ourselves and standing back up. This isn't easy. Ask a baby. How many times do they try, only to collapse on the ground? Babies instinctively know they have to adapt to external conditions they cannot change. If they could, they'd simply imagine themselves standing upright and stay that way. Those who promote positive thinking say you can do something with just your thoughts, like snap your fingers and change your circumstances. But you can't change anything with mere thoughts. The power of positive thinking is practically zero. We are surrounded by absolutely immutable, invincible determining conditions, and adapting to them requires significant effort. Another element imposed upon us is our capacity for foresight, and, conversely, the possibility of lacking foresight. Everyone has some degree of it. Can you live without any? No. You must have some degree of foresight because it too is imposed upon you as part of your structure. Naturally, this foresight comes with its counterpart, success and failure. Did it work out, or did it not? Is there any human action that escapes this binary of success and failure? No. Everyone learns this very early, even while trying to learn how to walk. Either it worked, or it didn't. Thus, we live within a complex and encompassing condition in which success and failure emerge as universal realities. Finally, to conclude this list of examples, there's one more element we cannot escape: subjectivity. What is subjectivity? It's the fact that our sensations and thoughts cannot be directly transmitted. They are not automatically shared. If I eat, that doesn't mean you are nourished. If I have a toothache, your tooth doesn't hurt as a result. Our bodies are discrete and separate, so everything that happens within us has no direct correspondence with what happens to others. This means we are, so to speak, trapped within ourselves. However, this is just one of the conditions. Subjectivity doesn't exempt us from any of the other conditions, but there is a great temptation to view this set of conditions as they reflect in subjectivity, as if the structure of the universe resides within us. This is what happened from the 17th and 18th centuries onward, treating subjectivity as though it were the key to understanding everything else.